Okay, it should be recording. And well, welcome everyone to riding the rising tide of seaweed farming. And what we're going to do tonight is, for a little while, is talk about the movement in the state to try to get the seaweed farming industry going. And it's a very, very new industry. There are a few people doing it in this state, and they're probably online here with us, and they're more experts than I am in this, but at any rate, there are a few people doing seafood or seaweed farming, and but it's still a very, very new potential industry for the state of Alaska, and I think it's really important to at least share with all of you what the potential is, and we're going to go over several issues here, and I'm going to just go ahead and start what we're going to cover tonight is we're going to talk. I'm just going to mention these things, and again, it's a very general talk. History in Alaska. There's a lot of traditional usage of seaweeds in the state, and of course, most of it's by native, and we'll talk a minute about that. I'm not going to go over a lot of detail in the biology of the algae, but we're going to talk about the complexity of it. You might think seaweeds are a very complicated or a very simple plant, you know, in the ocean, but it's really one of the more complex plants in terms of their life history, which I'll talk about. We'll talk a little bit about the culture. How do you go about doing this? What's the necessary steps? And a lot of this work has been pioneered by both Mike Steckel at the University of Alaska Southeast here at UAS, and he has done a tremendous amount of work for years and years and years, dealing with trying to work on the techniques of propagating the seaweeds for potentially an industry associated with it, and just understanding the seaweeds. And it's still he's still doing a lot of work on that. And also a lot of what we're doing right now is coming from the industry back in Maine and places like that on the East Coast, where they actually have a seaweed industry moving forward. And it's quite interesting what they're doing back there. And so you'll see a little bit of information from those folks. We're going to talk a little bit about what that commercial farming industry looks like. And when I talk about commercial, I'm talking about internationally. It's a very, very large one. I'm going to talk about some of the statistics involved in how important this industry really is in terms of the overall economics of aquaculture in general. It's quite a significant piece of the aquaculture industry throughout the world. We'll talk a little bit about the Alaska potential, what we think we can have here. And by the way, before I move on any farther, we'll hold the questions until the very end, and we have some people that will help orchestrate that here, and we'll answer questions at the end. And I may end up directing you to some of the professionals that are doing a lot of this work. But needless to say, I'll try to answer your questions. There are a lot of bottlenecks currently into producing this industry and making it go forward, and I want to talk to that. And what I mean by bottleneck, what I mean is there are things that have a tendency to get in the way of it moving very smoothly and very easily through the process, and they call those bottlenecks. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Permitting, it's not bad. I mean, they've got the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, and the Department of Natural Resources has pretty good record of doing this, and they're working hard at making this go as smoothly as possible. But it still takes time, and so that tends to be something that slows the process down. We'll talk a minute about that. And then marketing, we have very little information in the state of Alaska on that, but I'm going to show you the kind of things that are marketed when we talk about the commercial farming industry, the products that are available. And we're going to talk about how we hope to make improvements in that. And then what's currently being done. And a lot of that will be touched upon in the bottleneck section as well as the marketing section of how we're trying to address some of these issues when it comes to seaweed farming. As far as traditional harvest goes, the state of Alaska, of course, the indigenous people, the native people of the Pacific Northwest, have been utilizing algae for many, many generations. Primarily, currently, most of that is for traditional foods and subsistence for foods, and it's very easily they have pioneered that in the U.S. When you look at the U.S. has not been a group of people that have jumped on board seaweeds and eating of seaweeds. You know, it just isn't something that has been real pronounced. It's very, very popular in other places in the world. But the traditional harvest has been important. And in fact, as I'm showing in this particular slide, they use the bull kelp, which is the algae that is Neurocystis, that actually has long stipes. These stipes can be many, many feet. 20, 30 feet is common in our area. 40 feet, they can be very, very long. And I'll talk about the structure of these in a moment. And of course, they all have what they call in terms of this particular species, a sac of a gas up here, which is carbon monoxide, by the way. And what they do is they use that in order to keep these blades up here closer to the sun, obviously. It's important. But they would use this stipe to make things like cord, fishing gear. They use the bulbs as storage containers for some of the oils when they get hooligan and subsistence fish like that. So the coastal people of British Columbia are the ones that a lot of the information's from, but they would make fishing lines, nets, ropes, harpoon lines, anchor lines, and bull whip kelp. So there's been a traditional use, and it's still very important, and it's very significant that those things be maintained in the process of what we're doing. So we have to be careful of not interfering with any of that, and I think we can do this without it. If you're talking about the food, there are a couple publications that you can get a hold of here. And Alaska Sea Grant has both of these. This is Dolly Garza, who is the Sea Grant agent here in Ketchikan and was in Sitka for a while. And she was she pioneered, putting a whole lot of information out to the public on how you can eat seaweeds, how you can prepare them, how you can dry them. And she's got this nice pamphlet that is in the Alaska Sea Grant bookstore, basically, and it's one of the publications. And they've also, the Sea Grant has published a guide to seaweeds, and this is an excellent book showing all the different seaweeds. And by the way, that one also has some information in it about the utilization, notes on things like the vitamin content and the edibility of the different species. There are lots and lots of species of edible seaweeds in our area. In fact, most seaweeds are edible. Some are not so tasty, but most are pretty decent, and they all have very different flavors. So it's kind of interesting that there's a lot of potential for different things. A lot of the species, the native people that Dolly attributes here, a lot of them are red algae and things like that. But she has information on all that. So if you're interested in seaweeds and eating them and trying them, that's a good place to go, is to get one of these publications. So the algae, the kelp forests that we have, obviously the wild ones that we have around here, they've gone through a decline here in Southeast Alaska because of things like the reduction in the sea otters, and the urchin population would propagate to levels where they would eat all the holdfasts off of the bottom of the algae, and a lot of the forests were really impacted greatly by the fact that the sea otters weren't killing off and eating the urchins, which the urchins were preying on the algae. But they're very, very critical in nature, and that is because they provide habitat. And you can see in this photograph even though I don't think this photograph looks like anything in our region, but there's a lot of rockfish, there's lots of herring or something similar bait fish that live in those, and so they provide a very diverse ecosystem that is quite significant in terms of propagating some commercial species and things like that. Algae are very, very important for lots of things. So when you see these pictures and you wonder, well, you know, why do we need to farm it? There's algae and there's kelp forests everywhere. Well, there actually aren't. They're very, very unique environments that they have to live in, and it's because of the way they grow and the habitat that they grow in, and therefore they provide a very unique set of circumstances needed for some of our commercial fish and things like that. So very, very significant population. So harvesting the wild is probably not, and in fact I'm quite certain that the Alaska Department of Fish and Game and other folks would not permit commercial harvesting anymore. I know they had a problem at one time when they were doing a species called Macrocystis and using it for pen culture of herring eggs, herring spawn on those. They had problems with getting the permits in order to harvest enough of the algae to put in net pens that were holding herring. And so it becomes a significant issue that we don't want to really harvest it. And by the way, you can harvest these very easily, wipe out a bed just by harvesting the reproductive blades of the seaweed. So it becomes difficult to have any kind of a commercial market or commercial harvesting of the wild. So we have to turn to, and you're going to see a diagram later on in this that demonstrates that in terms of the world production, why you see very little wild harvesting. Most of it is done through farming. So the basic structure, talking about a little bit about the biology here, just before we can get into some of the meat of what we want to do with farming. The algae are kind of an interesting plant. All the nutrition that they gain is coming through the blades here. The blade is very critical in terms of producing the actual growth of the plant itself. They do not have any roots. When you see algae, kelp wash up on the beach, you always see this big bundle at the very bottom, and everybody always thinks it's roots. They're not roots. It's called the holdfast, this down here. And then that's attached to the stipe. This is the stipe that I was showing you that they make rope from on the bull kelp. It's very, very long and not in this kind of a structure. Some of the algae and the kelps have a midrib. Some have several, in fact, and they go down. It goes down the whole blade primarily, and the whole thing is called a thallus, is the actual plant blade structure here. And that's the basic seaweed structure. And it's quite different in that it doesn't have true roots. It gets the nutrition by taking the nutrients, the gases out of the water, such as carbon dioxide for photosynthesis, through the blades of the seaweed. And so you think, well, this is pretty simple. It doesn't have roots, it doesn't have rhizomes, it doesn't have flowers, it doesn't have any of this stuff. So this can't be a very complex plant. But it turns out that the life cycle is quite different. It is very, very complex in every different, and it's different for many of the species and the various colors. Seaweeds are usually characterized by their color, you know, a green algae, a brown algae, a red algae, or blue-green algae, and they all have very different characteristics. You know, the greens are commonly in a higher level, the browns are below that, and then the reds are very commonly at a little bit deeper in the water column, or low on the lower intertidal range. They all have very different properties. They all have different nutrition balances for as a food item, and they all have very different life cycles. But the algae go through what we call a sexual reproductive cycle from a and they go through a meiosis rather, and they create spores that have male and female gametophytes, And then they have asexual reproduction. The gametes will fertilize a plant and we get another zygote. So it gets pretty complicated. I'm not going to go over any detail on that, but the one thing you want to remember is when we're propagating these in a farming situation, we have to understand the overall propagation and the reproductive cycle of the particular species of algae, which is one of the things that we have to learn in our area. Now, Mike Steckel has done a lot of work in this, and he's got lots of information on all this, so he's quite knowledgeable on a lot of this. This is, in fact, Mike Steckel, University of Alaska. This is one of his slides from a program that we did together in Anchorage, and it's the life cycle, and it shows kind of what happens here. There's an area right in the middle here called the sorus on a sporophyte, and what that has is that's where the spores come from, and we're going to be talking a lot about that. That's the part of the plant that we will be using in the propagation of the species of algae in terms of a farmed product, and that's how we're going to propagate them in that. So what happens here, and we'll see if this works, we end up, this creates spores. The spores are released, and we're going to be talking about releasing spores. You have to release the spores in order to get them into an environment or so basically we want them to coat a string that we're going to utilize to propagate the algae. And then what happens, they settle and they germinate. They produce males, male sperm basically, and eggs from the female. And that's called a gametophyte stage. Those things then combine and make a mature type of structure, which can produce a recruit, a small blade, and we'll see these blades on the string that we want to propagate. And then that goes to a juvenile and eventually back, and the cycle repeats. But this is kind of a very, very simplistic version of what happens to in terms of the life cycle. And we have to know these various stages and how to treat them in order to propagate these effectively for a farm environment. Now, once it gets to the point where you've got them in recruits and juvenile, the work still continues, but it's much less of an issue in terms of keeping these going. Once you get these, this is where they're out in the environment and they're on a line and they're growing at that point. This step here has to be done in some kind of a controlled environment, a nursery kind of environment, and we're going to be talking a little bit more about that. So here's a photograph of, and this is the oh man, shouldn't have clicked the button there. Let's go back. This is that if you go back to that previous slide, the sorus right here, that's what this black spot is in some laminaria here, which is one of the species of brown algae that we're working with. But that's what the spores are incorporated in that. And so what you got to do is you got to prepare this sample in order to do that. And the Maine people have a really wonderful publication, which you'll all be able to download. It's free, and you can get it online, that really describes this process very, very well. This is just a picture out of that, and you can see here what ends up happening. It tells what materials, so you got all the materials you're going to need if you're doing this. You collect healthy kelp, and of course here's that sorus that we're talking about with there, and collect mature sorus tissue with minimally attached algae and organisms, which is called biofouling, and transport to the nursery. And what they mean by that is the minimum organism. There can be all kinds of things living on a blade of kelp. There can be bryozoans, which you're going to see pictures of a little bit later on, that can coat it and can interfere with the marketability of the plant when you're harvesting it. But there's also lots of plankton that will live on the blades and all that. So you want to get, clean as much of that up as possible. You want to identify and isolate this strip, and they show how to do this. And again, this is from that manual that is quite nice, and you really should get a hold of that if you're really interested in getting involved in this. You remove the excess biofouling, which can be all kinds of things, other algae, barnacles, all kinds of things can end up growing on the blades, and usually bryozoans and things like that, which are the little crystalline looking combs that grow on the blades, is very common. Anyway, they're showing it only if the source has extensive biofouling. Gently scrape the surface with a razor blade. They clean and remove the mucilage, which is this, it's like a slime that is on the surface. Firmly wipe the front and back 3 or 4 times with a paper towel, discarding the paper towels each time. You disinfect the tissue with again, you want to disinfect. There's a lot of disinfection, and so there's a lot of treatment here that you need to pay attention to. You dip it in 3% iodine solution for 30 seconds. You rinse it and put it in chilled filtered seawater, because you don't want to use seawater that's just going to repopulate the blade. And dry it. You can prepare it for overnight storage. Place it in paper towels. You can refrigerate it. And you can put it in certain circumstances here. They're talking about in a refrigerator that's set at 50 degrees for 14 to 24 hours. And then you prepare what we call settling tubes. This is where we're going to put it in, where we're going to actually do the work, and place the tank lid on top of the settling tube to prevent contamination. Contamination can be a real problem whenever you're doing anything in a culture environment. We see the same thing when you're doing oysters, when you're doing animals and things like that. So there's algae aren't free of those kind of proper handling. So we need to move forward on that. We need to understand those things, and all the algae are, as I said, can be quite different. Now here's some stuff from Mike's project. He's been checking that. They use a seeding string called Cremona, and it's I think they get it from Asia, from Japan and places like that. And it's a string that, for some reason, when spores are from the source tissue are released into the water, and it gets like a milky color because they're very small, those spores, and they will attach to this string very effectively. And it's a special string that they make. It's not just any common string. It's got certain properties that allow for good adhesion of the spores. And eventually those spores will get coated, and they'll eventually end up after several. This is a diagram from again, the main project that they have pictures of in there, and you can see that these strings are just wrapped around this, by the way, and they end up coating the lines. Well, eventually, once you get those lines, and they're given to the farmer or whoever wants to do this. If the farmer is doing the spawning or releasing of the spores, then so be it. But right now, probably what we're looking at is a nursery doing a lot of that work for farmers, and they can just get the string from them. And it's kind of an interesting process, and I'm going to show you this little tube here you'll see here. But it's given that it's taken out into the water environment where it's going to be used for the farming process. And the way it's done, it's kind of interesting. This is the string wrapped around a pipe. It's just a piece of pipe, and the ones they demonstrated, we had a workshop here in Ketchikan, and they were able to wrap this string around a pipe. And it was probably about I'm going to say 2 to 2.5 inch pipe, plastic pipe, and then they wrap it around there. They put this in containers in the nursery, where they change the light and the temperature, and they're able to get the spores to release, and eventually the string is very coated around the string that's been wrapped around that. They take this pipe with the spores that are obviously already starting to develop into recruits or small algae, And what happens is you then put a very long line, in, a very big line, you might be a ½ inch line or something like that, and this has got anchors on each end of this, and it can be 100 or 200 feet long, whatever length you've got of the string that you want to propagate your algae on. And what happens is you attach one end of that line out here, but the line is going through the middle of the pipe. And so when you back up in the boat and pull it, it just continually unwinds, and because it's coming off a circle that goes around, it just simply winds onto the rope like this. And you can see how it is. You can see the line right along here. You can see the little strings going around it. It just simply winds up onto the line, and you just do that till you get to the very end. Now you've got a big line with all this little string, and the big line, of course, is necessary because when these plants get to be 15, 20 feet long, they're going to have a lot of weight, and what's going to happen is this little string would break. But when it's wrapped around this bigger line, the line can take the strain. So that's what's happening with the way this is done. So we then move along, and we end up seeing what the string was getting these little recruits on it, and this is what the plants are doing as it's wrapped around the pipe. And this is again one of Mike's demonstration, part of his research project actually, and it's quite he's got beautiful pictures, and he's had a lot of work done in this, and I really emphasize you should do that. There's some really interesting process of how you do this videos called on YouTube, overview from the main Sea Grant program, and it shows a lot of this technique of how you propagate this and how we go about doing this. And this is just a site that you could go to. You could Google this as well. Go to Google Marine Sea Grant Program, seaweed culture or macroalgae culture, and you will find the YouTube will show you all these, and it's really worth going to and trying to take a look at this, because these sites are very nice, and it really emphasizes the main Sea Grant program has done a great job, because they've been doing this for a while, the algae, trying to promote their industry. So I put this up here and suggest that you go ahead and if you're very interested in this, they have good YouTube videos on how you do the farming, seaweed farming and macroalgae farming. So I put this on here just, and this is a couple of the sites. I don't necessarily know that you have to go ahead and look at this, but if you need to, you can go ahead and look at these sites and find it. So that's the basic issue of how we go about moving forward on the industry. So what about, why do we want to do this? I mean, why do we want to do it? Is there a reason why you want to do this? You know, first of all, yes, there's a lot of good reasons why we want to do this. And some of the demonstration of this is how important this is to the economy of several countries. It is very large scale. This is I'm going to just show you some quick shots here of the kinds of culture that are going on. Some of these places we're harvesting wild in here, but there's a whole lot of farming going on in a lot of places. So harvesting seaweed in Patagonia, there's beach casted seaweed that's harvested. In other words, this is stuff that is natural out here that breaks off and washes on the beach, and they're actually utilizing that algae in their as an industry. Seabed of a species is harvested at low tide, transported in a truck of the harvest biomass to a drying site, and algae are harvested in nets and all kinds of things. So they're doing it in places like Argentina. We also see them harvesting wild in Mexico. There's a lot of wild. So there's also a lot of farming going on in Mexico as well, but there's a lot still harvest of the wild seaweeds in places. And there are places where the environment is such, like these kind of large plains, where probably it can withstand a little bit of wild harvest. There's a lot of places where it's too I'm going to say the conditions of the environment are not conducive to allow for a wild harvesting process. So in Mexico, they harvest a species in Baja California here, and it's harvested by hand at low tide. In the harvest, men and women participate together, and they use it for various things. They use a lot of them for fertilizers. They use them for food. They use them for those kinds of processes. So it's quite important. But if you really want to see where people are doing this in a significant way, look at this farm here. These are all algae farm. This is in China. And this is one of the laminaria species. The laminaria species is what we're going to be doing some pilot projects here in Alaska right now, dealing with laminaria. We don't use this japonica, but we use one of the laminaria species. And this is a brown algae, obviously. And these plants might only be a couple of months, 4 months, 3 months in age, so they grow very, very rapidly, and they're quite significant. In this particular region, here they are doing porphyra, which is nori, which is one of the biggest crops, of course, that you all know of nori and things like that. You see it if you've eaten sushi. A lot of times it's made from these kind of species. And the farms are as far as you can see in places. So you can see this is quite large in places like Asia. Why? It's because it's nutritious, for one thing. Kelp is, and this is a photograph that I took diving on with bull kelp. And I've eaten a lot of bull kelp. I think it's excellent in soup. I dry it, and it's quite good. Kelp is rich in vitamins, minerals, trace elements, enzymes, but the composition varies with species and the time of the year. So there's a lot we have to learn about those kind of things for the marketability, and we need to do some research on that. And we still need, that's one of the bottlenecks that will occur as far as marketing. We need to understand that in Alaska. The one thing we've got going for us in Alaska is we have very clean water. We've got very good conditions to grow, and the product quality is going to be quite good. And that's really an advantage. A lot of places in these other places are not very, the conditions they're growing them in are not real pristine. You know, there's a lot of pollution and things like that. And remember, everything that is in the water that the plant is utilizing in terms of nutrients and things like that is coming through these blades. So they're going to pick up an awful lot of stuff. If it's pollution in the water, they're going to pick that up. It hasn't been a problem, but needless to say, if you have a cleaner environment, it's going to make, I think we can capitalize on that in Alaska harvest or farming industry. So the world usage of seaweeds, when you look at this, is seaweed production is about $10 billion per year. It's actually a little bit more than that now. About 27% of it is used really for fertilizer, feed, medical, biotechnology. 83% of it is still used as simply a food product, human consumption. Primary users, China, Japan, and the Republic of Korea. So those are some of the biggest producers of farm seaweeds. And if you look at the wild versus the aquaculture produced, worldwide macroalgae production, about 5.7%, is increasing every year, and more than 18 million tons of macroalgae were produced from global capture back in 2011 from wild capture and aquaculture. Of that, only 4% of it is really wild harvest. The rest is now being done by farming seaweeds, which is what we think we can be part of that thing. And by the way, that market is not being overrun by algae at all. There's a lot of room for growth. This is from a market report that I just found, and I thought I'd just read this to you, even though you can get this market report. It's a I think it's a GVC. I can't remember, but I was able to find it, and it has an interesting insight into what they're doing with algae. So commercial seaweeds used in the manufacture of edible food products, cosmetics, medicine for human consumption accounts for the highest market share, followed by animal feed and agricultural segment, which would be things like fertilizer and feeding animals. Rising demand for commercial seaweed in the pharmaceutical sector is projected to drive the industry over the forecast period. This was a fairly new report, by the way. And seaweed processing as an animal feed is known to improve health conditions of the livestock, maximize milk production, fertility, and feed conversion, increase in the adoption of this product in meals as an animal feed is expected to boost market demand over the coming years. The agriculture segment is projected to grow at a considerable rate on account of the growing usage of seaweed and fertilizers for plants and crops. And then there's a few regional insights that they had in this report. Asia Pacific commercial seaweed market has led the global industry with a demand share exceeding 80% in 2015. The growth in this region is driven by growing human consumption and increased usage in the agriculture industry. Indonesia and China are projected to experience various growth, followed by Japan. Europe is anticipated to grow at the second highest over the forecast period on account of the increasing use of seaweeds in the medical and health care industry. North America and Europe are also expected to experience high demand for this in the food sector, owing to its high nutritional and protein content. So I thought that was interesting to see that they're capitalizing on that. This is a good diagram showing you the growth that we're seeing from 1950 all the way to 2015 here. And as you can see here, we've got the darker green at the bottom line. These little bars at the darker green are the wild harvest. The aquaculture production is related to this other line. This is the aquaculture. This is the farm seaweed. And you can see it's almost going as an exponential growth here at almost 25 million metric tons, or million tons, I believe that is. Million tons of algae is growing, but most of it, as you can see, you're seeing very little wild harvest. Why is that? Because you can't do it. I don't think you can do wild harvest on this product and expect the algae beds to survive, and you're also impacting all the ecosystem that we talked about a little bit earlier. So I think that's very critical in the process. Commercial seaweed market, seaweed market analysis by product. Whoop. Let me go back. Product: brown seaweeds and red seaweeds and green seaweeds. By form, liquid powder flakes is a common. By application, agricultural animal feeds, human consumption, and segment forecast to 2024. You can see what we see going on there. This is in dollars, in millions of dollars, just in the U.S. This is U.S. commercial seafood market revenue product, going from 2014 all the way to 24, and we're talking about 500 million just for the domestic market. And you can see what species or what groups. Remember, I was telling you about the different the way they classify them in various types of algae, and you can see the brown algae are in the blue here color, and the red algae are in this reddish color, and the green is a little tiny green bar up there. So there's very little of the plants that are being propagated and harvested are really the green algae. It's almost all based on the red and the brown algae. So that's where we have to look at. And again, this comes again from that same market report. They're saying the global commercial seafood market was valued at US dollars at $10.31 billion in 2015, and it's still increasing demand for seaweeds in the food and pharmaceutical industry, and for the production of animal feed is anticipated to boost the market growth over the forecast period. Growing awareness of the medical benefits that seaweed provide, coupled with increasing demand for seaweed-derived snacks and foods, are expected to boost human consumption. So as you can see, from a market standpoint, it's really there for us to capitalize on if we can pull all of the bottlenecks that are necessary to move it forward in this process. And the kinds of things that I just show you what some of the commercial products are now. There's calcified seaweed. So these are things like soil conditioners, fertilizers. There's some medical stuff. They actually are using paper from seaweed fiber now and things like that. So there's a whole other, there's kelp meal, there's mannitol, which is from the medical field. So there's a lot of products being produced. You've probably all seen this if you go to Costco, if you're in the area. They have, in fact, my son loves this stuff. He eats it like candy, and he's 30, so I mean he's going for it, and it's one of the seaweeds. This is not coming from the U.S. production, but it's certainly something that we can look at. Back east in the Maine program, they're using a lot of this. Maine's own seaweed salad. They have a salad that they produce like this. They have various species of kelp, dulse, and these are different reds and browns and things like that. They actually are producing a type of noodle. They call them kelp noodles. Oh, wait a minute. Kelp noodles that they're putting out, and they've got some snacks here. And so there are, and this is some seasoning, and of course it's an excellent source of iodine, as I've already mentioned. The hydrocolloids, alginates, those kind of things, agar, all those things can be used as thickeners, and they're used very commonly in things like toothpaste and ice cream, and looks like they're in various flavored foods for the pet industry and stuff like that. So there are lots of properties. There's lots of face creams that are being used, and a lot of this stuff here, seaweed soap, by the way, over here. And it's even used in some beer type production. But needless to say, there's a lot. And the fact, these kind of like the hydrocolloids and the alginates, they use 15 to 20% of the world seaweed production. So it's pretty significant. Biofuels and biotechnology, you've probably all heard of this. There's microalgae. These are more or less a plankton that they can produce biodiesel fuel from. Macroalgae, they can produce methane as a fuel, and they use a biodigestion. They can produce ethanol and butanol by fractionation of fermented sugars that are in the blades of the algae. You know, we are looking at using a sugar laminaria here, and if you dry it, there's a little grains of sugar on the surface. So there's a lot of sugar involved, and so there is the ability to utilize the fermentation products of those sugars to create ethanol and butanol. And potential for fuel feed co-products, especially aquaculture feeds, is very high. And as you well know, that we're, you know, if you've ever been involved with any of the salmon industry and the artificial foods that are used in the salmon ranching, the feeding the young, they usually use fish meal. They're moving out of that because there just isn't enough fish meal around. It's getting so expensive that the bio products from algae potentially have a role to play. So this is just some of the harvesting of biofuels going on in China, and this is some of the products that they get out of that. So potential for food and all those, the same basic things I just mentioned. The way a lot of this is done is, again, they do it through chemical synthesis, and they can get a lot of those products. And then, of course, the fermentation process is just like using ethanol from corn. You know, you're fermenting using the bacteria and cultures and things like that. And you do the same thing with chemical synthesis. So this is a picture of fucus, which is a brown algae that we have here. It looks green, but it's brown. The carbohydrates, they have they have water, of course, associated with them, and carbohydrates, polysaccharides, alginates, agar, that's those ones we just talked about, the thickeners, mannitol. They have a lot of proteins, digestible, inhibited by polysaccharides, lipids, mostly polyunsaturated. They have fatty acids, minerals. They have a lot of minerals, ash, calcium, potassium, iodine, carotenoids, and vitamins. Eat about 1 gram of seaweed and your daily iodine needs are taken care of. Calcium higher than broccoli. Protein is almost as rich as the beans, legumes. Seaweed is mostly soluble fiber, and the kind that turns into a gel, slowing down the digestive process, thus inhibiting the absorption of sugar and cholesterol. So those are the kinds of things that are being touted as a health benefit that we should be able to market if we go through this. So we've got a grant. What we're doing right now, and we're getting close to finishing here, we've got a grant called the Alaska Mariculture Diversification, Innovation, and Technology Transfer Grant. That's a long name. And what we're doing is we're taking, and we did this for a very simple reason. This is a sea grant project, a national sea grant project that we were able to get the grant for, and I'm one of the PIs on it. And the reason we chose this is because the Alaska mariculture is really, I think, the biggest entity right now is oyster farming in Alaska. There's a few other people doing some other things, mussels, and there's a few other, and there are people doing the algae as well. As I said, there's a few farms. There's one right in Juneau, there's one in Kodiak, and those people are doing a wonderful job at figuring out how to do this. But again, we've got to look at what we want to do in terms of marketing and overcome some of the bottlenecks. But one of the reasons we chose oyster farms is for a very simple reason. The grant's only a couple-year grant, and we didn't want to spend the time frame necessary to get the full permitting process where water chemistry is necessary. DNR requires a lot of sampling, and the department requires sampling, and it takes time to get all through the paperwork. It's not impossible. They are not trying to make it difficult, but it takes time. They want to be careful. And so we went with a farm because oyster farms, it's just a permit alteration in most cases for them to do this. And so we could actually get a experimental demonstration project in the water very quickly, and I think we've got 7 farms that are willing to participate in this, and we're having difficulty with our algae timing of it, which we'll talk about here in a moment, but we've got the ability to do that, and that's what we're going to do, because you can get product out in just a few months, really, in 4 or 5 months, no problem at all. So the things that the farmer has to do, he has to maintain the long lines, and that means doing some water monitoring, water temperature, salinity, turbidity, nitrogen levels, and control the flotation may be necessary to add weight. This is just a shot of what happens. So again, algae have usually some type of a gas bladder. And why do they have a gas bladder? Because they don't want to be laying on the bottom out of the sun. They want to be at the surface where the sun is where they can gather as much light, because these are plants and they do undergo photosynthesis. So they need to be up on so sometimes the plants get sucked to the surface, and we really don't want them all the way at the surface. They do better if they're a little bit down. So you have a lot of these kind of things that you want to monitor. So there's a little bit of maintenance. In fact, there's quite a bit of maintenance on this, but it's not overwhelming. And a lot of this maintenance can occur during a period when there's very slow growth on things like oyster farms and things. So we can utilize that capability. They want to check for biofouling, for example. This is some laminaria. And you can see this is that bryozoan, that white crystalline structure on the surface. And it's important to deal with. It doesn't really do a lot of damage to the plant, but what it does do is it damages the marketability of it. So you probably are going to want to harvest it before the springtime, when this has a tendency to propagate very heavily onto the blades of the algae. This is just a couple shots. This, of course, is Maine, and this is typical of somebody's structure that they developed to take the algae off. And you can imagine the weight of this. It's quite significant, and all this is very heavy, and they're selling it by weighing it and getting it to the market. On the East Coast, they're doing this, and we're learning from some of their techniques, and we probably are going to be trying to acquire knowledge from other countries as well. And we have a Sea Grant agent here that is a specialist in marketing of seafood internationally, Quentin Fong, who is part of this grant and is looking into these kinds of things, and very capable. We'll try to come up with some procedures that will allow us to move forward on how to go about this. So these are all things that we're moving forward on, but they still have a ways to go. Let's talk about these bottlenecks real quick. Seaweed culture, genetics. I'm going to talk a minute about genetics. There's an issue with genetics, and I'll show you that in a slide in a minute. The farm site, the permitting, sometimes it takes time to get through this part so you can start doing the work, and you have to do the water sampling, and that's a lot of time before you can actually do the processing. The real big ones are marketing, transportation, and processing, and we are looking at ways of getting through on this and actually work towards this. And one of the things we're going to try to do is get a specialist on the Sea Grant program, a marine advisory agent that will specialize in mariculture, and he will be dealing with oysters as well as this and can put a lot of effort. Most of us agents are very multitask. We do a lot of different things, working with lots of things outside of this kind of culture. So we would like to get somebody that just is specialized in this to work towards making this industry move forward. And let's look at one of these bottlenecks. This is one of the bottlenecks and this is being done by the Department of Fish and Game, is being very, very conservative at this stage until the science is examined. They are putting a restriction that if you have a farm anywhere in this 50-mile area, and this is Ketchikan here just as an illustration, and say you have a farm here, you can only gather algae that is going to be on your farm to propagate and to get put in the nursery so that you can get the strings covered with spores, but it has to be within this 50-kilometer restricted area and distance from the algae, and that becomes 50 kilometers rather, and that becomes quite and say you have farms over here, which there are. In fact, some of the people we're working with are over here. That means they have to gather separate algae, bring it in here instead of having this facility doing it. This is being done because they want the genetic diversity. They're worried about if you propagate a large amount of algae from a few blades or 50 blades or 100 blades, then it may overcome the whole area, and they don't want that to happen, and they're being very conservative. There's nothing wrong with that. It's absolutely the appropriate thing to do. We need to understand if this is if the genetic component, the genetic makeup, the algae here is very uniquely adapted to this area rather than this area. We don't know the answer to that, so we need to know that. And so right now, this is kind of a issue with us. In the East Coast, they don't worry about this. They just do it, and it hasn't been a problem. But we need to be protective in Alaska because it is such a critical, important species to maintain. So the 50-kilometer restriction is really significant. It's quite important, and that's why we want to keep working at this, and some of the science that we're doing can shed light on that. If the department figures out that, well, the spores are being carried all over Southeast Alaska, there's no reason to restrict that requirement. So it's just a matter of us gaining enough science and enough sampling in order to really address that. And I know that there is currently a NOAA project that they've asked me to get involved in that is looking at potentially collecting samples, hundreds of different spots, and they are interested in doing that very thing to look at this genetic component. And again, it's primarily a protection for the wild components of the algae from the farms, and it's the appropriate thing to do. We just need to understand it. Another stumbling block: what if the plants are not fertile? This is Mike Steckel's work, and he's got a Sea Grant project as well, and he is looking into a lot of this stuff. What if the plants are not fertile when they're needed? And what he's doing is he's determining in his grant when natural plants are fertile. We really need to understand this. We know that getting the fertile blades is in the fall for him up in the Juneau area. Down here, fall is probably a little bit late for some reason. We had difficulty when we went on the same timeline. And so we need to understand these things in order to overcome these bottlenecks. Can gametophytes and sporophytes be cold banked? And what that means is, can you put them in an environment that with temperature, light, and salinity and nutrients that allows them to just go dormant basically until you're ready to put them into the marine environment? Can we seed strings with cloned gametophytes for large scale cultivation? And you'll have to talk to Mike about that. I don't know what advantage there is to clone ones, but that's kind of an interesting aspect. So you're basically looking at determining the optimal conditions for growth in the lab, and what we can do with these things. What about transportation and processing? Well, we've got an issue with transportation, and if you think about transportation, what we end up having is you've got farms in very, very remote areas. It's not like in Maine where you can drive along the beach and probably get a boat and go out and harvest your thing and you can drive it to the processing that you want to do. In our case, we've got real remote areas. We're looking in, and we've got people working on this. We're looking at, what about processors? When you harvest this stuff, you're harvesting it in a time frame that is kind of interesting. It's a time frame that is outside of the typical usage of salmon packers, for example, the packers that run out to the why not, if cold storages, for example, have processing or shipping capability and tender capability, why not send one out to go to each of the farms and collect the algae so that the transportation is fairly fluid and easy. It's at a time when they're not being utilized, and it's not always good to have a large boat like that that we aren't able to utilize. You want to be utilizing. They're making money when they're being utilized. So we're looking at that. In terms of processing, let's see. Do that again. In processing, there's a couple things that we're talking about. We need to address some things. We need to stabilize the algae when we harvest it, and that keeps it from decomposing, losing its value as a product. The energy needed to do that stabilization, for example, if you're using drying to stabilize them, how much energy are you going to use in the cold storage, for example, if they are able to do it in their process in March, because you're probably going to be harvesting in March. And the reason you do that is because that's before those bryozoans and some of those epiphytes that are going to grow in the blades can detract in the value of the product. And so you want to look at, well, what kinds of, in the processing, we want to know, what are the desirable products? Is a dried product beneficial, or do we want to make wet products? Do we want to produce flavored products? What's the nutritional value? And what about concerns about food safety? We need to worry about that. Well, there's a facility, Kodiak Seafood and Marine Science Center out in Kodiak, that is a primo spot for that, and we should try to capitalize on the utilization of that facility. In fact, I don't know of any other facility. They've got all the chemical equipment and the diagnostic equipment in the laboratories, GCs and DNA sampling equipment and all kinds of things that they can do to look at this nutritional value and food safety and things like that. Plus they have all the seafood processing equipment that's available there, including drying and all those kinds of things that they can experiment with and get products that we can capitalize on the state of Alaska and move forward. So I think we're going to try to utilize the Kodiak Center to help us move this industry forward, which can be very, very huge industry. So there's a lot of sources of information all over the place for this. I won't bother going through this, but you can Google a lot of this stuff, and there's a current status of global seafood is that one that I was showing you that had a lot of the information in it. We also have a website that you can gather a lot of that information, http://aquaculture.seagrantuaf.edu, and we can move forward on that. And I got questions here, but I'm going to just show a couple more because we got a few more minutes. It's only 6 now, so we've got another half hour. So what I'm going to do is go and show you a couple other pictures of the Ocean Alaska, which is the nursery that we're talking about down here that we want to actually release the spores on. Mike Steckel can do that also in his laboratory in Juneau, but Oceans Alaska can do it as well down here, and go ahead and go into a production mode, and you can see a presentation that they made at the Fish Expo called the Mariculture presentation that they have, and you can find that online if you just look at this site. And you'll be able to bring this PowerPoint, by the way, up on the Alaska Sea Grant site. It is being recorded, and it will be available for you to download, so you can get these websites. But the Oceans Alaska Mariculture facility looks like this, and they've got the ability. They're doing lots of oyster in here right now, but they are doing our phase, our Sea Grant phase of the Seaweed project, along with Mike is doing some of the work too, up in Juneau. But we've got them working on this, and it's quite beneficial. They're doing a lot of experimentation with their algae and their things, and they put this as part of their thing. Seaweeds provide nurseries for marine life. They improve water quality. They uptake excess CO2 and nutrients, nitrogen and phosphate. That should be mitigate pollution. I don't know why that didn't copyright, but gives off oxygen to help with dead zones. And what I mean by this uptake excess CO2, you've all heard of ocean acidification. Well, algae are plants. They need CO2, so they take CO2 out of the water. What causes ocean acidification is CO2. So actually, large-scale algae, very, very localized area around where they are. If you've got oysters growing or shellfish growing, it also will raise the pH in those areas to some degree, and that actually is a benefit for the bivalves and things like that. So there are some positive benefits to this as well. So the Seaweed project, it's an ADF&G permitted project they're following at Oceans Alaska, the ADF&G, Alaska Department of Fish and Game genetic policies. Seaweed spores are seeded on the twine. Seed lines can provide seasonal crops. Global seaweed production is valued, they've got now at about $12 billion, which is probably the latest figure they've got. And supplemental traditional foods and food security, it can supplement that. If there's any impact from traditional harvesting, we can somewhat mitigate some of that stuff. Here's some more websites that you'll be able to go to. Alaska Fisheries Development Foundation, and those kind of things. It's kind of interesting in that the governor, and I had a thing about the governor in here. The governor has put forth a committee or a panel that is, let me see where I've written that down here somewhere, where he's got the government task force, Mariculture Task Force is moving forward, and they really are working. They want to have in 2018 a report to the governor. The governor's requested how we can move forward on this mariculture initiative with seaweeds, and because he sees it as a real benefit. And you can also go to the Oceans Alaska website as well and see some of that. So we'll go back to that slide with questions, and we'll talk a minute about questions. And I guess we have some people that are moderating some of the questions, and Beverly or Melissa or Sunny, do you have some people that are asking questions? I've got some chat questions here, I think, that I'll look at here while you're trying to talk, if that's some of you have something. But that's pretty much the presentation.
No questions on Alaska, but thanks, Gary.
Okay, did everybody get anything out of that were in on Alaska? Did they feel like they were able to pick up a few new pieces of information about it?
Yeah, she really enjoyed it, and the person here is actually from Maine, and so
good.
she knows a little bit about seaweed aquaculture in general. So yeah, she said she enjoyed it.
Good, very good. Okay, how about Sunny? Anybody there in Petersburg?
Yeah, hey, Brian. Hi, Gary. I've got one question here from Brian Paust.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hey, Gary, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Brian.
Do we have any larger scale processors who have expressed any interest to you in processing this material?
That's a great question. In the past, I've had it, but I haven't heard anything recent. And I know that there are a few that are interested. Simply because, you know, they're doing things like shellfish, you know, they're doing sea cucumbers and urchins and things like that locally in some of these large processing plants, in Ketchikan at least. And, you know, you got to keep the plant open to do those small things. Why not utilize more of the space? So I think that there is a possibility that if we can demonstrate some products and give them the energy requirements, if we go through the experimentation out in Kodiak, for example, and get those things, I think, Brian, that we can potentially move this a little bit forward. Sometimes these companies and things, they need to have a demonstration of what's possible. They're not going to just jump into it unless they know it's going to be something that's going to sell, that's going to be profitable and move forward. We need to be able to do that. We need to be able to present them with the potential of the market of this. And I think that that's what we're trying to do on a smaller scale initially. And then hopefully we can, there's kind of an economy of scale at this level. There's so new in the state of Alaska. The marketing is really one of the driving products that we need to concentrate some effort on. And we're hoping that if we can get a specialist, that they can put a lot more effort into really trying to develop that marketing potential and demonstrate to these people and have some of their their support, that they're experts at marketing and they know how to do it. And if we can give them products that they think are good, they will hopefully move forward. But to answer your question, I don't have any large scale myself. I have not been heard of. Now, there are lots of companies down south that are interested in this, that are interested in coming up here, but they're not our traditional processing industry people in the state of Alaska. And I think we need to try to help our native industry, our native processing plants, and convince them that this is something that they can benefit from. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I haven't seen anything large scale yet.
Yep, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd like to say a few things.
Got another one, Gary?
Okay, go ahead, sure.
I'm a veteran, and I had 4 bypass put in, and when I was 65, I'm 84 now, and I figured out finally what kelp does for you. It dropped my bad cholesterol 30 points right after I got on it. My immune system jumped up. I haven't been sick or had a cold in 4 years. I take a teaspoon of dried kelp every day that I dry myself. This kelp is what I use, and I just like to get that on somewhere on the record. I talked to Sheila that ran here in our area, and she didn't make it in. But anyway, our senator, I talked to him and I said, you know, with the results I had, I could not understand why Alaska hasn't got off their stern end and started developing our kelp industry, because it's so valuable to our health and stuff. And a lot of our food is not getting it. And I'm going to shut up here in a minute. But anyway.
No, you're saying all the right things. You're saying all the right things. I agree totally with what you're saying, so it's good to hear.
Yeah, I talked to Sunny here a couple of days ago, and I was really concerned because I never saw any markets that were growing. I could see the Korean and the Japanese, and I knew there was one down in California and places like that. But where was Alaska? And
Yeah.
I realized that you guys were really pushing, and I hope you're the best
Well,
results. And if I could do anything for you, I'd be glad to.
oh, that's great. It's really good to hear you, by the way. That was excellent. And I agree totally with you. You know, I've been eating algae and soup every day, and I don't know whether I've never had any real major problems, but I think that it helps me, and I really like it. And it has a wonderful flavor. It doesn't, in fact, I use bull kelp. In fact, I do some of the blades of bull kelp, and I dry them myself, and it's just wonderful in soup. It takes the flavor of the soup, so you really don't taste it as like a fishy or a seaweedy flavor to it, and it's just wonderful. But the nutritional value of it, I know, is very, very high. And the reason, maybe not in bull kelp, there's other dulse and those kind of things have very, very high nutritional rates. Some of the other kelps don't have quite as much, but they're all probably still extremely valuable for your system, because they've got nutrients and trace metals, things like that are not available in most land plants. And so I think that it's really a high value product, and it's slowly getting more recognition in the U.S. But the U.S. has been lagging. It's just not one of those things that such a bountiful country and with a huge farming industry, it hasn't had a place, and people aren't as familiar with it as in other places. But I think that as we learn more about the nutritional characteristics and the value that it has, I mean, they're doing all kinds of things with medical things now with it as well. And as you said, you're definitely seeing improvement in your system, probably based partly on the algae. So I think that this is that was a very, very good question, and I appreciate your comments on that.
Okay, Gary, we'll let you go to the other ones.
Yes. Wait a minute. Can I ask you one more question?
Sure.
Is there areas where the kelp is growing where we should not be picking it? Or like around city, does it?
Yeah. Well, I don't think there's anything that's going to hurt you. It's just whether or not the kelp that can withstand that, because it's not hard to wipe out a wild population if you take it at a time when the spores are just getting ready to release and all that kind of thing, and you can actually cause some issues from a wild standpoint and in terms of subsistence use. But a single individual getting a little bit of kelp to eat on a regular basis is probably not going to be an issue. I have no idea what the regulations are from Fish and Game, and you'd have to look into that. But I certainly have gotten it and enjoy it. And I don't take dilute an area. I take a little bit from each plant and make sure that it's not the stuff that has the spores, the blades that have the spores in there, and that kind of thing. So I don't think there's anything from a health standpoint you're going to have an issue with. I think our water is pretty pristine, and we've got such huge tidal ranges that I suspect that any dilution would compensate for most of the problems. I don't think you should do it out in the front of a sewer outfall or anything like that, but I mean, most natural places are probably very, very healthy. I don't think there's any issues there, as long as we don't get some kind of radiation spurt or something like that, because algae can concentrate in fact, a lot of the sampling for food, the the Japanese thing were being done on algae, because they will concentrate it a little bit because they utilize so much of the nutrients in the water. But we're not seeing anything that's even dangerous, so that's not an issue. And in Alaska, we haven't seen any, as far as I know. So I don't think it's a problem.
Red tide.
We have an issue
Well,
with
no, red tide will not be a problem. That red tide comes from a dinoflagellate called Alexandrium, and even domoic acid, which is now, if the blades get covered with it, you probably, when you wash it, you would wash it off. But they're not going to absorb the saxitoxin from the Alexandrium into the blades, and they're probably not going to absorb the domoic acid, which comes out of the Pseudonychia diatom that causes the another kind of paralytic shellfish problem. It's a little bit different, but it's still a red tide type biohazard. But it shouldn't be an issue with that. They should be just. I'm sure if you wash it, you're not gonna have any of those diatoms in a concentration that will be a problem.
Hey, Gary, we'll let you get to the chat questions, and I'll let you know if we get some more coming back here.
All right, let's go down this chat thing here. Let's start it.
Gary?
Yes, go ahead.
Tori.
Okay,
This is
Tori.
Tori. Yeah, I've been kind of monitoring the chat thing, but actually, could you go to Astrid there in Kodiak? She has about 15 folks there with her, and she has a couple of questions. So why don't
Sure.
you engage her, and then we just have a couple of questions on the chat so far.
Is she going to ask them, or is she just going to? Are they on the chat?
Astrid, I don't know. Are you able to?
They're on the chat, so she doesn't have the.
Okay, well, let me see if I can find her here.
Yeah, go down to the bottom there. I think Julie is there, and there are some questions.
Oh, this is Julie. Here's been seaweed. Has there been any seaweed production sold yet from our state? This is Julie, an audience question. I know that there is a farm in Kodiak, which you're probably well aware of, Julie. And I talked with her, and they are farming it. I don't know if they've sold any of it. I don't know that there's been any sales for this. I think there's one in the Homer area, and there is definitely one in Juneau associated with Mike Steckel's project. I know that there's a farm there that's been operating. And there could be a couple others, but I don't think that there's any large-scale sales. If they do, they're probably using very localized markets. So I don't have a real good answer on that. The way to find out about that would be to get a hold of Alaska Department of Fish and Game and look at their and talk to the aquaculture people over there, and they would be able to tell you whether or not there's anything that's been sold at any scale. Okay, that's the best I can do, because I don't know the answer as to what sales are on it.
Okay, Gary, and there's another question out of Kodiak. Where can we direct questions for interested folks who have permitting questions at this point?
That is, again, Alaska Department of Fish and Game. Go to the aquaculture permitting, and Cynthia Pringham is probably going to be the best source if you look up her name, Cynthia, and she would probably be the one I would go to, and she knows about all the permits for in the state that have farm permits. And she also knows the process very well. And again, they're working very hard at making that process pretty streamlined. They're trying to move it forward because they really want to get this industry going. So I would go to the state of Alaska initially. They would be able to tell you what permits are necessary. For example, what kinds of permits you're going to need from Department of Natural Resources, for example, from DEC, from the department in terms of the farm, and they will be able to get you through that. The ones that I've heard about, it takes anywhere 4 to 6 months, something like that, when you don't have an oyster permit or something that can just be altered. I think it takes about that, and it can move forward with it.
Thanks, Carrie. Are there predators associated with kelp seaweed production or other issues that could substantially destroy or affect any crops? Do you have any information on that part of the production?
Oh, I'm sure there are. I'm sure there are. There are certainly crabs and things like that that munch on it without question. And I'm sure that there's some of that going on, but it's probably at the rate that it grows, it doesn't hurt the plant. Is the interesting, if you get on an angiosperm, a land plant, and you start chewing away certain pieces of it, it dies. But the algae are really getting all their nutrients. You're not cutting nutrient sources off for them. They're getting their nutrients out of the seawater. So I think that it's pretty. They can withstand a lot of abuse from predators, and so I think that. But there certainly are. There are certainly. I guarantee you that there's organisms that are utilizing it, and I don't know what species at this point. It probably depends on the species of algae. That probably have different predators. But yeah, there's crab that do. And you see, like you get decorative crabs are tearing chunks of algae off of stuff all the time to use as camouflage, So there's all kinds of things going on in the marine environment that we have to learn about. And I don't think there's probably not a huge amount that goes on in a cultured standpoint on a farm because those things are hanging in the water column unless you've got certain fish that want to munch on it and things. But I don't think there's a lot of that going on in the environment. They seem to be doing very well where people are running these things and they're not having major problems with predation. It's not like a locust attacking your product. It's got to be a marine organism.
Thanks, Gary. I have two questions here that I want to pull out. There was one earlier, I think earlier in your production or your presentation, you referenced a handbook and someone wanted to know what that was. And then the second one that's up here now is, do you have any way to, or any reference materials on approximate wet to dry weight ratios if you're into a dry product? But first, if you could give that on the handbook that you were referring to.
The handbook. The best thing to do is I think my email address is on the Alaska Sea Grant site, and I'll send you the site to get that. It's so if anybody is interested in that manual, and it's really good, it's done in Maine and it's free to get. It's not anything that costs you any money, and they have it to download, and it's really, really quite good. And it talks about, I know what you're talking about there. So if you email me, and that's not a problem to email me, Gary, Gary .Freitag, FREITAG at alaska.edu, and you can also look it up on the Alaska Sea Grant site. Get my email address, and I will make sure I send you the site in which you can download that. I'd be happy to do that. Okay. Now, on the other issue was the wet ratio. I don't have those figures. I'm sure it's very different. Some blades of algae are one layer thick, and some are several layers thick, so that some get real leathery looking, and so they're very, very different. So I don't think there's any key to what that would be, but they're almost weightless, almost when you dry them, because they're very, very. There's a tremendous amount of water associated with them, the cells. So I suspect that it's going to be a very, very high weight to dried ratio if you look at that. And so if you can stabilize the product as a dried product, the shipping weight is going to be very, very low in comparison to shipping in a wet weight, because they're very, very, a bunch of kelp is very heavy. A small bucket full is quite heavy. So, but then again, in some places, I had some figures here. I have the light on, so I can't see anything anymore, but I should turn the light on so I can see it. But I had some figures on that, and it's amazing the amount of dollars associated with this. In Maine, for example, the product is they're getting large dollar per pound for the it's, you know, like I think I sell $50 a pound in some cases. Depends on the species, of course, but it gets very, very high. And I've got some of that numbers here somewhere. But I can relay that to you if you give me a call. There's a whole bunch of that information online, by the way, and it's very, very available. Okay, and if I find it here as I'm looking there, I'm going to go ahead and turn my light on so I can see something in this office. It's just black.
Gary, while you're doing that, we had one other question that came
Okay.
over.
Good. Go ahead.
Is there a question about, is there any new information on whether growing conditions are better in central or in southeast Alaska? Is there any updates on that?
Well, I would suspect, and I know that there's a report that Mike did years and years ago that suggested that the farther south you get, the better off you are. And the reason that is the incident angle of the sun is greater, and it allows for better growth. I don't know that that's the case because there seems to be quite nice algae in the central area. Okay, what I had, let me go back to I'll answer that one again here. The main industry, they're talking about 50 to 60 cents, I'm sorry, per pound for the edible grade algae. Rockweed crop is about $20 million a year is what they're getting right now. The kelp, chili kelp, $540 million a year, and Japan's nori is about $2 billion a year. So that gives you an idea of the potential. And we have the ability in our area to do as much or more than that. So it's we've got pristine conditions. This state really should be looking at that very carefully. Anyway, so what was the other question again that you were asking? Did I answer it? I think I did.
Yeah.
Mollusks and echinoderms. Yeah, there's somebody said that the predators include mollusks and echinoderms. Yeah, that's true. There are some snails and things like that that probably feed on it, and echinoderms are obviously the echinoderms are things like the urchins and things that are chewing at the base of the stipes and all that kind of thing. So yeah, there are problems, but those again are something that are probably not likely to cause a problem because they're running around and they have to climb. They're not going to get it unless they climb up the buoy lines and the anchor lines. It's going to be a little bit difficult for them to get to it. You know, certainly urchins will not be able to get there very easily. They can't swim up to the blades that are only about 5 to 6 feet below the surface of the water. You know, a couple meters below the surface of the water is where you hang those lines.
A couple of questions there, Gary. You might see there's somebody was asking about what are some of the good traits of an adequate farming site. And then there was a question about the Maine Department of Commerce state figures was 15 million pounds for about 400,000.
400,000, that's correct. Yeah, I've got that. And again, you know, I think all these figures you're getting, and I got these figures out of the main manual that I was talking to you about. And the problem with a lot of the figures are the numbers are skewed because a lot of times they're talking about one species. You know, they're not talking about the entire crop, whether it's being used for food or whether it's being used for pharmaceuticals. All those things get jumbled in the statistics of the numbers. So you get a lot of different numbers associated with it. At least my experience has been I see different numbers every time I look at a different report. It's somewhat different. Needless to say, it's still fairly significant. And of course, Maine is not a huge I guess, should I say, it's not a you know, they're still in the growing phase of their algae production and trying to figure out what the markets. I know that the people we're working with there have been marketing some of their product in places like Whole Foods and things like that. So they're looking at a very, very domestic market, and niche markets basically is what they're looking at. And those are going to be smaller scale than if you can tap into some of these large scale processes. So I agree. The numbers are different. The numbers I got were from the manual that I was able to get from online from Maine. So
Gary, yeah, it looks like that people are also curious, and this maybe goes back to that other question about what are some good or characteristics of a quote good site for farming. And do you have any idea how large a spread the farms in Kodiak and or Juneau might be right now?
Well, they're not. I mean, there's a couple things that seem to be good, and that is you want to have good flow in the area. So you don't want a stagnant area, you know, like a pond area. It depends on the species again. Some kelps require a lot more water motion and flow, and others don't. So it depends on what you would be growing. You know, some of the red algae have probably will have a much higher value, and those are a little bit deeper usually. So you have to have good levels. You also certainly have to have some sunlight, you know, the ability for the sun to get to the plant. These are plants, and they need sunlight. And so you want to have an exposure that isn't like a big mountain right next to you that's going to shelter where the sun is most of the day. That's not going to help. So I think those are and of course there's pH requirements and nutrient requirements and all those kinds of things. Most of the water we have is probably pretty suitable in Alaska anyway, from nutrients and things like that. I think probably what's going to drive a lot of it is probably going to be the amount of solar radiation that can get to the plant blades, and things like that are probably going to be very, very some of the more critical things to look at. And flow and a current sometimes is very beneficial. If you look at where kelp beds are, they're usually in fairly larger kelps are in somewhat. There are some benthic, I mean, some of the sugar kelps are in pretty still water on the bottom. And those probably require a little bit different environment that isn't quite as stringent as some of the other algae. So again, these are all things that we're going to try to explore at what ones we can make happen. But I suspect that all these different species of algae, and they all have very different life cycles and everything else, are probably very adapted to all the different environments that they would get exposed to in Alaska. Since we're only going to use Alaskan broodstock, or whatever you want to call it, you're going to be looking at you know, all the different species that have very different environments. There's algae in just about every place I've ever dove. So you know, as long as it's in the light zone, you're probably going to have algae in there, and they're all going to have different characteristics. So I can't tell you exactly what they're. I know that both the farm in Kodiak and in Juneau have fairly long lines that they're utilizing, and they're just hanging a couple of these lines in the water, and the plants grow off of them, and like they showed in those pictures, and they're harvesting in that way. And it's I'm sure there's quite a bit of current in both places. So I think that there's current and some solar radiation are probably some key factors. Again, we'll try to have all this stuff as we try to develop this. You know, we'll probably end up with a manual on how to do this in the future in Alaska, I would suspect, especially if a specialist on there that can put something like that together, that will have a lot of those details of what's necessary for a site.
Great. Gary, thanks very much. Someone was able to post, you can see there on the Keenan, posted what he thinks is the link to that manual.
Yeah, I think that's it. That is it.
Okay,
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Keenan Reed put that on there. Very good. Thank you. So on the chat, there's that link is there, so that's good. I saw, yeah, like I say, the main numbers. I'm just throwing out some numbers, trying to indicate some of the potential. There's a ton more of those numbers. They all look pretty darn big and pretty important to me, and I think that we can capitalize on that, especially when you start thinking about a $10 billion industry worldwide, and they haven't tapped that market. You know, there's room for growth in that market, and the aquaculture can't supply enough. They haven't done it yet, so I think it's pretty good. Okay, let's see here. Miss Smith, I apologize. It's ready for draft. What makes a good site? Yeah, that's the farming site, Lynn. Nancy said, is there new information to back up whether kelp grows better in central or southeast? That's the one you mentioned. Again, you know, I don't think that there's any new information on it. Like I say, I heard that, you know, I know that Mike had a thing saying that, you know, the incident of the sun is kind of a critical piece, but I think it grows fine in central as well as southeast Alaska. Tori, you would know. Is there much kelp in your area? I think there is, isn't there?
Yeah, well, I'm up here in Prince William Sound, and you know, we definitely, you know, we've been watching. In fact, I think we were one of the net importers on what you're referring to with the earlier row-on kelp fisheries.
Mm-hmm.
So depending on which species you're talking about, like the laminaria, that's definitely a southeast product. But yeah, we're poised and ready. I think there's a lot of interest in it. Gary, I was just I put out just a general call to anybody else on the chat or in Sunny's office or anyone else if there's any other questions here before we end. We've gone a little bit over, but that's okay, and I think it's been a great interchange. So, Sunny, any questions there?
Yep, we got one more here.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Brian Paust here. I was the Marine Advisory Program for a number of years. I took a very deep interest in this many years ago, and I think one important thought that I wanted to put out to you is that we don't have to reinvent the wheel here.
Mm-hmm.
There were pioneers in, for example, in the Puget Sound area. Tom Mumford from the Washington Department of Fisheries comes up, and they did these manual types of things, very comprehensive things. And one name we can't forget is from British Columbia. BC did a lot of work in this. And BC waters are very similar to a certain degree with our waters here in Southeast Alaska, and also to a certain degree in Central Alaska. Louis Druhl, Dr. Druehl, has a whole raft of literature about how to do it, and important lessons in site selection and all this kind of business.
Yes.
And just to kind of show you, and I throw this number out at you. I remember there's one document that shows that there's some 76 variables, when you're looking for a site.
Yep.
There's 76 things, but actually I found that a lot of our sites here in Southeast Alaska can meet them very well. So don't feel alone. There's a lot of information out there, and people like Sunny here. And I'm an emeritus professor, so that means that you can call me anytime. So Paust, P-A-U-S-T. I'm there in the literature someplace.
Oh yeah, Brian. No, in fact I've looked at some of the stuff you've done in the past, and it's great. And I agree with you totally. One of the things that we did when we were starting the aquaculture and the salmon farming is we went to BC and places where they were doing it, and learned a lot. And it's always best not to reinvent the wheel, as you said. And I think we will do that very thing without question. One of the reasons we chose Maine was because they're doing seaweed culture on a regular basis now with, and we're willing to interface with us and actually work with us. And that was one of the key components of why we selected them as part of the grant process. And but I agree totally. We need to get a hold of those people, and I think we need to do some work. And hopefully we can get, as I said, a specialist that can go and actually have the time to actually meet with people down there and dig into their research that was done, and hopefully avoid having to do a tremendous amount of work at trying to solve some of these bottlenecks that we perceive. You know, some of the bottlenecks that I mentioned in there, like the marketing and the processing for product quality and usage, is something that still needs to be done. And I think that because that stuff changes over time anyway, you know, people, you know, the desires of what people want are very changeable, and what's a fad today isn't a fad next day, and something else drives it. So I think that we need to, and not a fad, I shouldn't say it's fad, it's you know, can be a very, very desirable product that we can move forward on. So I feel good about that. And I think that the potential of this is very, very large. And it can actually change a lot of our smaller communities throughout the state. There are marine facilities which are hurting. And I think that it's very good to diversify economies in these small places, so that we can move forward, because I think that they have the potential, this has the potential of being very, very significant in the economy of especially our small communities in Alaska. So Brian, I appreciate your input there, and I agree, and I may give you a call just to get those names again, and maybe we can dig into this a little more and see what kind of information they have in their manuals. I have several of the manuals that have been done, and I've looked at them, and they're all, you know, this isn't rocket science, I understand that, but it is complex. It's a lot more complex than you would think of a species that's this simple as a primitive species. It's very complex to grow and deal with, but we have a lot of the technology already solved. It's just there's a few little things that we need to address. So I appreciate your input there, Brian, and we'll keep in touch with you on this. Anything else, Tori?
Not that I'm seeing. I think we pretty well covered the questions on the chat. Brian in Petersburg, if it's okay, can I put your email out on the chat line here, and then people can feel free to contact you?
Sorry, Brian actually had to leave. So
oh, okay.
I can't answer that for him. Sorry.
That's
Okay,
fine. We'll definitely be in touch with him, and if you need to get these things, I can potentially field some of the questions and route them in the right ways. So if people
right, Gary, I put your contact information out on the chat, including your phone number. So
okay.
So that sounds good here. I don't see anything else coming up. So with that, Gary, I think we might be able to conclude.
Good. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. I really appreciate you signing into this, and I hope we provided a little bit of information for you. Again, it was pretty general, and it can get very complicated, but I think that this at least gives you a footing at what we're talking about and the potential of it in Alaska. And I think in the next several years, I think we're going to try to make progress on this, and it's got the governor's support right now, so I think that we can move forward on it, and I think that'll help grease the wheels a little bit. So for everybody that came, thank you very much for coming, and I hope I was able to give you a little bit of information that might help you get involved, or at least spur your interest. So thanks again. Okay.
Thanks from here. Nice job, Gary.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gary.
Thank you.
Thanks,
night,
Gary.
Okay, Beverly, I'm going to go ahead and stop this thing.
Right. I think you're the recording guy. So good job.
All right. And let's see here. I can say stop recording.